Before we begin this journey, take a close look. Before you are silent figures, contorted as if created from pain. They do not scream, but their silence is louder than any words. The faces of these people are wounded, exhausted, distorted by grief. Their hands, large and tormented, seem to carry the weight of history themselves. They cover their mouths, squeeze their eyes shut, reach for the sky. This is the world of Osvaldo Guayasamin. A world in which paint has become the language of the oppressed and canvas, a battlefield for truth. Guayasamín did not create beauty in the usual sense. His art is not for contemplation, it is for experience. Every line, every stroke is an emotion. It is crying, despair, screaming. It is anger for which there are no words left. His paintings are not illustrations of history. They are history itself. Etched in paint. Let's start with a trip to the Ecuadorian parliament, and you will soon understand why. Imagine, you enter the main hall of the National Assembly of Ecuador. This is the place where laws are passed, where democracy and the will of the people are discussed. But before you can look around, your eye is instantly drawn to a giant fresco on the wall. This is not decoration, it is a challenge. Among the images is a terrifying figure in a military helmet. But on this helmet is not a coat of arms or a flag, but 3 letters, CIA. This is not fiction. This is the art of Osvaldo Guayasamin, created in 1988, and it is one of the most resounding gestures of political protest ever to enter the national parliament. This monumental mural is called Young Fatherland, and was painted right where 137 deputies sit. But its main message is not addressed to them. It is addressed to history.to memory.to pain. Guayasamín depicted a figure resembling a soldier or a tyrant, wearing a helmet with the letters CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, written on it in bold letters. It was a direct and public rebuke of American intervention in Latin America. When George P. Shultz, then U.S. Secretary of State, visited Parliament, he was deeply outraged. But for Osvaldo Guayasamín, there was no such thing as too harsh. His brush knew no fear. It was not just a work of art. It was a political statement engraved on the walls of the government. Bold, direct, like a blow to the heart of official history. We begin our journey with this mural to understand Guayasamín, that it is not enough to just look at his paintings. You have to learn to hear the silence from which they are created. In this video, we will delve into a world where art is not decoration but resistance. We will see how the pain of childhood is transformed into a brush. How the personal intersects with the historical. How the artist shows death, dictatorship, hunger, and at the same time seeks tenderness, love, and human dignity. Ahead of us are dozens of works. Some of them will shock you. Others will hurt you. But together they will form one great story about the 20th century through the eyes of a man who never silenced the truth. Friends, please support us with likes and subscriptions for regular content, and thank you for watching us. To understand why Osvaldo Guayasamín saw pain in art, we need to go back to the very beginning. He was born in Quito, the capital of Ecuador, in 1919, into a family that had nothing but labor. His father was an Indian, his mother a mestizo. He was the first of 10 children. They lived in poverty. The street was a school of survival. Childhood was not idyllic but a trial. Instead of toys, he had a paintbrush. Instead of books, he had the faces of passers-by. At the age of 8, Guayasamín was already drawing portraits of his classmates and teachers and updating advertising signs in his mother's shop. Later, against his father's wishes, he enrolled in the School of Fine Arts in Quito. Where there should have been inspiration, there was fear. In those years, Ecuador was in a state of constant protest and political turmoil. And it was during one of these protests in 1932, when young Oswaldo was still a student, that an event occurred that changed his soul forever. His best friend, Manjares, was shot dead in the street during a student rally. Not from old age, not in a hospital. Just a bullet, asphalt, and silence. This was not just a personal loss. It was the first trauma of a generation that took root in him. And it was then that his first major work was born, created in 1941, a painting called Dead Children. In this work there are no names, no portraits. In it are all the children taken by the streets, war, hunger, and indifference. And in it is the first cry that would later become characteristic of Guayasamin's entire style. Since then he no longer painted pictures, he poured out the pain that never went away. His canvases do not depict scenes but emotions, carved into angular lines, clenched mouths, and eyes full of emptiness. And yet there was no despair in this darkness. Because even among the most terrifying images, a hand still reaches upward. Perhaps in prayer, or perhaps in a last hope. This was only the beginning. A long journey awaited him: America, Mexico, a meeting with Nelson Rockefeller, friendship with José Clemente Orozco, and trips to Latin America, where he saw what he would later call tears that became salt or stone. But it all started with one boy standing next to his friend's body, and realizing that it was impossible to remain silent any longer. In the 1940s, when Osvaldo Guayasamin was still finding his feet as an artist, the world opened its doors to him not through calm, but through a chance encounter. His first exhibition in Quito sparked a wave of criticism. The works, full of pain and distorted faces, seemed unacceptable for academic art. But at that very moment, Nelson Rockefeller arrived in the city. Seeing the paintings of the young Ecuadorian, he was impressed. And within a few months, Guayasamin was traveling to the United States at the invitation of the State Department. In America, he saw large museums for the first time and became acquainted with world painting. But the real discovery would come a little later in Mexico, where he met José Clemente Orozco. It was there that he discovered murals, not just walls, but a space for the voice of the people, for memory and resistance. He sees how an image becomes a political gesture and understands that his brush must speak louder than any speech. This understanding will explode in full force in the mid-20th century, when Guayasamin creates one of the most famous and harshest series in the entire history of Latin American art. It would be called the Age of Anger. These paintings do not tell stories, they scream. There is no peace in them. The canvases depict contorted bodies, hands covering eyes and mouths, reaching toward the sky. These are not hands in prayer, they are hands of despair, suffering, a call for justice. The faces in the paintings are stretched, crushed, often without eyes. They do not need to be seen, they need to be felt. In the series The Age of Anger, the image of fear as a collective experience is born. These paintings are a response to the military coups that swept through Latin America. They are a reaction to the silence after torture, to women who have lost their children, to workers who disappear without a trace, to propaganda that erases humanity. This is anger that has been held back for a long time and has now burst onto the canvas. The paintings Tortured and Hunger, like Scream No. 3, are not just works of art. They are testimonies. Each of them is a story about what the state can do to its people. About how easily the body becomes a target and the soul a silent witness. Hands occupy a special place in these works. They are not part of the body. They are heroes of a separate language. Sometimes hands cover the eyes as if they do not want to see what is happening anymore. Sometimes they clasp the head as if trying to keep the pain inside. And sometimes they just hang there, tired, devastated, but still human. Guayasamin did not seek universal images, he painted humanity in a moment of decline, when dignity disappears and pain becomes the only truth. But even in this hell there was always a fine line between fear and resistance, between powerlessness and dignity. After these works, the world could no longer ignore Guayasamin's voice. He became a chronicler of the emotions experienced by those whose history did not make it into the textbooks. And it is these paintings from the Age of Anger that we are showing now, not to evaluate the technique, but to feel what words cannot express. And it is from this period that his next great gesture will begin, the painting Tears of Blood, created in the year Chile fell. But more on that later. On September 11, 1973, the world stopped for millions of people in South America. In Chile, a country that had been considered a model of democratic development just yesterday, the military seized power. Early in the morning, they attacked La Moneda, the presidential palace in the capital. Inside was President Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected socialist. He did not surrender. He spoke to his people on the radio while shells exploded around him. And when it became clear that there was no way out, he died in the palace with a weapon in his hands. On the same day, mass arrests, killings, and repression began. Thousands of Chileans disappeared without a trace. Among the first victims was Victor Jara, a musician whose fingers were broken so that he could no longer play. Pablo Neruda, a poet whose work was a symbol of humanism, also died shortly thereafter. His death still raises questions. The coup was not a spontaneous outburst of anger, but a carefully planned operation, supported and coordinated from across the ocean. Documents that have now been declassified prove that the CIA, the White House, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger were involved in the coup. They were not afraid of Allende's ideas. They were afraid of the very possibility that a poor country could manage its own resources without the involvement of transnational corporations. It was against this backdrop that Osvaldo Guayasamin created one of his most powerful and painful works, Tears of Blood. In this painting, a figure stares directly at us. Her gaze is frozen in fear. Her mouth is covered by her hands. And from under her fingers flow streams of red tears. This is not just sadness. It is shock and helplessness. It is the moment when the entire continent realized. Your voice, your will, your democracy are worth exactly as much as the great powers allow them to be. Guayasamín does not depict a specific person. It is a collective image of Latin America, a continent that cries, loses hope, covers its face because it does not want to see the truth that cannot be changed. The painting is silent, but its silence is deafening. Tears of Blood is not art about death. It is art about the loss of the idea that people can decide their own destiny. But why did all this happen? For the United States, Chile in the 1970s was not a country, it was an economic project. Allende began to nationalize key industries, copper, energy, banks. He wanted profits to remain in the country and go toward education, healthcare, and housing. But this was contrary to the interests of large corporations. And so the US made a decision. This model had to be destroyed demonstratively, brutally, publicly. The CIA organized funding for the opposition press, strikes, and economic sabotage. And when that proved insufficient, they put General Augusto Pinochet at the head of the country, who turned Chile into a laboratory of fear. The population reacted instantly. The streets, which yesterday were filled with posters and hope, were now filled with silence and bodies. Mothers lost their children. Children lost their voices. But Guayasamín's art did not allow this silence to prevail. In his paintings from those years, we see women crying without tears, faces that have lost their features, hands that still remember the warmth of those who are no longer there. It is not just anger, it is a deep, epic grief that does not seek sympathy but says, I remember everything. We remember everything. As Osvaldo Guayasamín approached the final chapter of his life, he realized that paintings were only fragments. He needed space. Not a gallery, not a museum. A place where pain itself would have a home. A place where people could not just look but feel. This is how the idea of the Chapel of Man was born. He began to create it in the mid-1990s in his native Quito, on a hill overlooking the city. From here you can see the roofs of houses, the lights of the night, and volcanoes on the horizon. But it was here that a space for another kind of eruption was to be created, emotional, human, spiritual. This is not a temple of religion. It is a temple of human dignity. Guayasamín conceived an architectural structure that would combine paintings, sculptures, murals, light, and silence into one powerful gesture. In the center is a fire burning in memory of all those who have died, been forgotten, or been despised. The walls are decorated with series of works from different periods. Everything in the chapel speaks. The paintings are not exhibits. They are windows into the soul of humanity. Hands appear again and again on the walls, but now not only in despair. Now they are in embrace, in forgiveness, in hope. This space was the artist's last gesture. And the deepest. He put everything into it, not just his brush but his life. Guayasamín dreamed of seeing it completed. But in March 1999, while in Baltimore, USA, he died. His heart stopped, but the chapel remained. Today, the Chapel of Man is not just a place for tourists. It is a sanctuary of human pain, open not for contemplation but for experience. No one speaks loudly here. Silence is more important than words. And when you stand in front of those same hands that once clutched your head in anguish and now reach out to another hand, there is nothing left but silence. Because this silence is not emptiness. It is memory, experience, presence. Osvaldo Guayasamin is gone, but his voice remains. He taught us not just to look but to see. Not just to listen but to hear the silence. And not just to live, but to remember that we are all human beings. One person, one pain, one resistance. Thank you to everyone who watched this video to the end. If you liked it, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. See you next time.